Every Tuesday morning, just after sunrise, a rusted flatbed truck turns down the gravel road outside Miller's Fork, and every Tuesday morning, the same three neighbors stand at their fence lines to watch it pass. The truck is always loaded with something nobody wants. Splintered coop frames with the paint peeling in long gray strips, collapsed nesting boxes stacked like broken teeth, twisted wire mesh curled into rusted knots, roofing panels punched through with holes the size of a fist. Dana Whitfield stands in the bed of that truck with her boots planted wide, steadying the load with one hand, and in the other hand, she holds a scarred wooden folding rule that used to belong to her father. Nobody in Miller's Fork can explain what she's doing. 3 weeks ago, it was 2 abandoned coops from a farm auction 40 minutes north. Last week, it was a collapsed poultry shed a widower sold for scrap price because his knees couldn't take another winter of chores. This week, it's an entire truckload from a hatchery that closed its doors for good. Every purchase looks worse than the last. Every purchase, somehow, seems to make her more certain. She never explains herself. When Carl Deaton leans against his mailbox and asks if she's opening a junkyard, she just smiles and keeps unloading. When the Hensley twins ride their bikes slow past her fence line to get a better look, she waves and keeps measuring. She walks the length of every board before she touches it. She runs her thumb along old hinges to feel where the rust has eaten through and where it hasn't. She unfolds that wooden rule, presses it flat against a rotting joist, and writes a number down on a scrap of paper before folding the rule shut again with a soft, practiced click. Then she moves to the next piece, and the next, sorting the wreckage into piles that only make sense to her. Her son Eli, 9 years old and missing a front tooth, trails behind her with a wheelbarrow, and even he doesn't know the plan. He knows his mother hasn't slept much since the accident on Route 9 last spring took his father. He knows the money from Daniel's life insurance is thinner than anyone in town suspects, and thinner still after every truckload of what looks, to everyone watching, like garbage. But he also knows his mother has never once looked at these piles of broken lumber and rusted wire the way she looked at the bills spread across the kitchen table those first few months. She looks at the wreckage like it's already something else. What could anyone possibly build from abandoned chicken coops? If you've ever been the person everyone quietly doubted, if you've ever built something out of what other people threw away, stay with this one until the end, because Dana's story is about to answer a question none of her neighbors thought to ask. Hit subscribe if stories like this one matter to you, give it a like if you believe overlooked things can still become extraordinary, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Dana bought the farm 2 years before Daniel died. 22 acres of red clay and scrub pine that the previous owner had let go fallow. It was supposed to be their fresh start, a place where Daniel could finally run the small engine repair shop he'd always talked about, and Dana could grow vegetables to sell at the Saturday market. Then a delivery truck ran a stop sign on a foggy morning, and the fresh start became something Dana had to carry alone. She is 38 years old, and everyone in Miller's Fork agrees on 2 things about her. She is quiet, and she pays attention. She isn't the kind of woman who announces her plans before she's tested them. She watches how water moves across a field after a hard rain. She notices which fence posts rot first and which ones somehow never do. She remembers, from childhood summers spent with her father building sheds and mending barns, that most farming problems aren't solved with money, they're solved with attention. And attention, unlike money, was something she still had plenty of. The wooden folding rule had been her father's, worn smooth along the edges from 40 years of measuring in his hands before it ever touched hers. He gave it to her the summer she turned 16, the summer he taught her to true up a crooked doorframe using nothing but patience and a steady eye. Now it lived in her jacket pocket every single day, and it came out every time she needed to make sense of something broken. Measuring board length, measuring the pitch of a roof, measuring the distance between fence posts to figure out how many predators could slip through a gap nobody else had noticed. It wasn't sentimental decoration. It was a tool she trusted more than any tape measure from the hardware store, because her father had taught her that a straight line, once you find it, doesn't change its mind. The real reason Dana kept every scrap she bought had nothing to do with nostalgia and everything to do with arithmetic. New lumber cost money she didn't have, new wire mesh, new roofing, new nesting boxes. All of it added up to a bill that would have buried her before she ever raised a single chicken. But scavenged material, sorted carefully and repaired with skill instead of cash, cost almost nothing but time. Every rotted coop held salvageable framing timber underneath the rot. Every collapsed shed had roof trusses that only needed new bracing. Every rusted roll of wire mesh, cut down and doubled over, could still keep a fox out if you knew where the weak points were. She wasn't hoarding junk, she was harvesting bones. It was Walt Pruitt, the retired county extension agent everyone called Old Walt, who first understood what she was doing, mostly because he was the only one who bothered to ask questions instead of assumptions. He found her one October afternoon sorting salvaged nesting boxes into 3 separate piles behind the barn, and instead of asking what on earth she was building, he asked her why she'd separated the boxes that way. She told him the boxes with intact backs were going to become the core of a new structure. The ones with damaged backs but solid floors were going to become nesting inserts she could repair with half the material. The ones too far gone for either were headed to the burn pile, but not before she pulled every usable nail and hinge. Walt nodded slowly, the way a man does when he's just realized he underestimated somebody, and from that day on, he came by every week or two, not to fix anything, but to ask the kind of questions that made her think out loud. "Why do you think the fox got in through the east corner and not the west?" he'd ask, and she'd have to walk the fence line again to find the answer herself. "What happens to moisture in a coop with no roof overhang?" he'd ask, and she'd stand in the rain the next storm just to watch. He never once told her what to do. He only ever asked her to notice something she hadn't noticed yet, and every time, she found the answer on her own. Usually a day or two later, usually while lying awake with Eli asleep down the hall. Walt's questions didn't stop at the fence line and the roof line. He'd sit on an overturned bucket while Dana worked and ask her why she thought the birds clustered in one corner of the run every afternoon instead of spreading out evenly, and she'd spend the next hour watching shadows move across the yard until she understood it was the only patch that stayed dry after a rain. He'd ask her why some of the salvaged lumber held its shape through a season of humidity, while other boards warped within weeks, and she'd go back through her measurements to realize the warped boards had all come from the same collapsed structure that had never had proper roof overhang to keep the wood dry. Every question sent her back to the wreckage with fresh eyes, and every answer she found on her own stuck with her longer than anything Walt could have simply told her. The nature of Miller's Fork does not care whether a woman is grieving or broke or determined. That first winter alone on the farm arrived early and hard, a cold snap in November that dropped temperatures into the single digits 3 nights running. Dana had assembled her first coop from salvaged frames just weeks before, proud of how quickly she'd pieced it together, and she lost 11 birds to the cold before she understood why. The coop looked solid, but she'd built it the way the original owner had, with ventilation gaps up high that let out warm air just as fast as the birds could make it. She stood in the frozen yard the next morning with her father's rule in her hand, measuring gaps she should have measured before, and she did not cry where Eli could see her. She rebuilt that coop from the studs out, this time sealing the upper walls and cutting ventilation low near the floor, where stale air could escape without stealing warmth on its way out. She packed the wall cavities with baled straw, scavenged from a neighbor's barn cleanout, an old trick Walt mentioned almost as an aside, insulation for the cost of hauling it. When the next cold snap hit in January, she lost none. Spring brought foxes instead of frost, and this loss stung differently because it happened at night while she slept 20 yards away. She woke to feathers scattered across the yard and a gap in the fence mesh no wider than a fist, exactly wide enough for a young fox to squeeze through at a corner where 2 salvaged wire panels didn't quite meet. She spent the next 3 days walking every inch of fencing on the property, her father's rule pressed against every seam, marking every place where reclaimed material didn't align perfectly. She learned to double the wire at every joint and bury the base a foot into the ground where digging predators like to try their luck. The next fox that came through in April left without a single bird, and Dana watched from the porch as it paced the fence line twice before giving up. Each failure taught her something the last one hadn't. She learned that deep litter bedding, built up in layers instead of stripped and replaced, warmed the coop floor from the compost heat rising underneath the birds all winter. She learned that rotating small mobile pens across the back pasture kept the soil from turning to mud and gave the birds fresh forage instead of the same patch of dirt, which cut her feed costs more than any bargain at the co-op ever could. She learned to catch rainwater off every salvaged roof panel into repurposed barrels, so that even in a dry August her birds never went thirsty. None of it was luck. All of it was the same pattern repeating itself. A failure, a long look at what went wrong, a small adjustment, and a result just slightly better than before. By the second summer, something had shifted in Miller's Fork that had nothing to do with weather. Carl Deaton, the neighbor who'd first joked about a junkyard, found himself standing at Dana's fence one morning, not to mock her but to ask how she'd managed to keep her flock so calm, through a heat wave that had half the county's chickens refusing to lay. She told him about the shade cloth she'd stretched over the run using salvaged roofing panels angled just right to block the worst of the afternoon sun, and about the shallow water pans she kept refilled from the rain barrels so the birds never had to wait on a well pump that struggled in the heat. Carl listened longer than he'd ever listened to anyone about chickens in his life. The Hensley twins stopped riding past out of curiosity and started riding past to ask if they could help carry feed. Even the women at the Saturday market, who used to trade knowing looks whenever Dana's name came up, began asking quiet questions about her eggs, which had somehow developed a richer color and a sturdier shell than anything else on the tables. Mockery had softened into curiosity somewhere along the way without anyone quite noticing the exact moment it happened. And curiosity, given enough time and enough proof standing right there in the yard, was slowly turning into something that looked a great deal like respect. It was around this time, almost exactly halfway through her second year, that the truth about the Coops finally came into focus, and even then, only for those paying close attention. Dana wasn't simply rebuilding chicken housing for her own flock. She was designing something that could be taken apart and put back together anywhere, a modular system built entirely from components any struggling farmer might already have lying in a barn or a ditch or a collapsed shed out back. Every panel she built was sized to interlock with the next. Every repair method she'd developed through trial and failure was simple enough to teach in an afternoon. She wasn't just solving her own problem anymore. She was quietly building a blueprint that any family with more determination than money could follow. She still didn't announce it. She simply kept building, and the Coops kept multiplying across her back pasture in a pattern that made increasing sense the longer you looked at it. Small mobile units for rotational grazing, a central winter structure, insulated with baled straw, a covered run woven from doubled and buried wire mesh that no predator in the county had managed to breach in over a year. Word spread the way it always does in small places, slowly and then all at once. A homesteading family 2 counties over drove out after hearing about her predator-proof fencing from a cousin. A local schoolteacher asked if she'd bring a few birds and a demonstration to the elementary school's farm day. A young couple renting a few acres nearby, barely scraping by on part-time work, showed up one Saturday asking if she'd walk them through what she'd learned, because they'd just inherited 3 broken-down coops of their own and no idea what to do with them. Dana said yes, the way she said yes to nearly everyone who asked, not because she wanted attention, but because she remembered exactly how it felt to stand in a yard full of wreckage with no idea if any of it would work. By the following spring, there was a waiting list of families wanting her to walk their property and tell them what could be saved. She never advertised. She never charged what the work was worth. The reputation simply spread on its own, the way trust does when it's earned instead of announced, one family at a time, one repaired coop at a time. A retired couple from the far side of the county drove out one weekend with a truckload of coop scraps they'd been meaning to haul to the dump for years, convinced there was nothing left to save in any of it. Dana walked the pile with them the same way she'd once walked her own, separating what could be reborn from what truly needed to go, and by the end of the afternoon they had the frame of a working coop standing where a heap of rot had been that morning. A young farmer just starting out on a few leased acres came asking about the rotational pens after seeing how green Dana's back pasture stayed compared to everyone else's, and left with a hand-drawn layout scaled to his own smaller plot. None of it happened quickly. None of it happened because of a single lucky break. It happened because one family told another family, and that family told the next, until the waiting list stretched longer than Dana had time to keep up with on her own. The test came during her 3rd winter running the farm alone, a February blizzard the county hadn't seen in 19 years, the kind of storm that buried fence lines under drifts taller than the gates themselves and dropped temperatures low enough to crack water lines across half the region. Neighbors with brand-new, store-bought coops watched their birds huddle and shiver despite modern heat lamps that flickered and failed when the power lines came down. Dana's flock, tucked into the insulated winter structure she'd built from salvaged framing and baled straw, generating their own warmth from the deep litter beneath their feet, came through the 3-day storm without losing a single bird. Walt came by once the roads cleared, standing in snow up to his knees, looking at the coop that had survived what no other coop in the county had. He didn't ask her a question this time. He just nodded, the same slow nod from that October afternoon years before, except now it carried something closer to respect than curiosity. Every failure she'd survived, every fox and frost and dry summer, had quietly been preparing her flock, and her, for this one storm that mattered more than all the others combined. The reward Dana found in all of this was never the money, though the money did eventually come, in small, steady amounts from the families who paid what they could for her guidance, and the visitors who bought eggs at the market for a little more than the going price, because they knew exactly where those eggs came from. The real reward showed up in smaller moments that mattered more. Eli, now 12, could walk into any coop on the property and explain, without prompting, why the ventilation sat low instead of high. Families who'd once stood helpless in front of their own wreckage now had working flocks and a little more food security than they'd had the season before. Children from town who'd never touched a live chicken in their lives spent a Saturday afternoon learning to check for healthy feathers and clear eyes. What had once been discarded, unwanted, laughed at, had become the foundation for something no one in Miller's Fork could dismiss anymore. Years later, the farm looks nothing like the 22 acres of red clay and scrub pine Dana and Daniel first walked together. A dozen coops, each one traceable back to some collapsed shed or abandoned hatchery lot, stand across the property in a pattern that still makes sense to anyone who understands how she built it. Visitors come through most weekends now, not gawking the way the neighbors once did from their fence lines, but studying the way Dana once studied, learning to see potential where others see only wreckage. Eli, 13 now, leads some of the tours himself, and he still carries a folding wooden rule in his back pocket, a newer one, though he insists on measuring things the exact way his mother taught him, the exact way her father taught her. Dana still keeps the original rule in her jacket pocket every single day, its edges worn smoother now than when her father first pressed it into her hands. She still pulls it out to measure something new every time a fresh truckload of wreckage rattles down the gravel road, because in the end, the tool was never really about measuring boards or fence gaps or roof pitches. It was about believing that something true could still be found inside something broken, if you were patient enough and humble enough to look closely. What people once mocked as a pile of ruined chicken coops became, in the end, proof of something simpler than anyone expected. Nothing discarded is ever truly finished. It only waits for someone willing to measure it twice before deciding what it can become. Where are you watching this from tonight? Have you ever turned something everyone else had given up on into something worth keeping? Subscribe for more stories like Dana's, because the world is full of overlooked places still waiting for someone to look closer.